Welcome to another episode of the Kubik Report. We have a most interesting person with us today who's lived and living at least 3 careers. His name is Kurt Hoyer, whom I have known for several decades. I've known him through reputation. I've known him through his wife's parents who lived in West Lafayette, and I was pastor of the Lafayette Church. And the Hoyers would come through every so often, and so I got to know them, and he has actually spoken in the Lafayette Church. His careers have been with Ambassador College. He's also worked with the Foreign Service, as I have mentioned, and lately he's become very, very passionate about the connections between archaeology and the Bible. And he did an M.A., Master of Arts, degree at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. That was one reason why he moved to that career after officially retiring from the Foreign Service. So with that introduction, I want to get right to Kurt. So welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Victor.
I'm just so grateful that when we talked in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago when I was there for the Day of Pentecost, I was so happy to see him. And what I thought as we were talking, here's a person who could really be helpful and could share the knowledge that he has. So I'm grateful that he's here. But Kurt, I gave just a very, very broad bird's eye view, in fact, more of an astronomy view of your life, without very much detail. But I've also met, with Kurt in Manila, Philippines, and perhaps other places around the world where we bumped into one another. But Kurt, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background with Ambassador College, your history, a little bit in the Church of God. I know our audience here will be broader. We aim for anybody tuning into our podcast, and I have many, many friends in the church and out of the, not part of the United Church of God currently, who listen to our podcasts. I'd like to hear more about yourself from you.
Okay, well, it's fairly standard to a certain point for many people with a history in the Churches of God. My parents were baptized into the Worldwide Church of God when I was about 2 years old, so I grew up in that fellowship, and then sort of moved along as those changes came about. I currently, we and my wife and I currently attend with United Church of God here in Northern Virginia. I attended Ambassador College beginning in 1982, and while there, I thoroughly enjoyed my childhood. I thought it was great. All my friends with summer camps, all those sorts of things that the church was able to provide. Ambassador College was a great experience. I was able to participate in a couple of different programs. I was taking French, so I was in the French summer program, working summer camps in France. I went on the Jordan project, taking handicapped children in Amman. And that's kind of where I got my first interest in working for the Foreign Service, actually, because we interacted with a lot of people overseas who were in the diplomatic community. And I said, well, that sounds like an interesting job for me. So maybe I should try that. So it took a few years to get in. I worked for the Ambassador Foundation, as you mentioned, for a number of years after graduating. I taught English in the island of Martinique. My wife and I then taught English for a couple of years in the country of Chile. We managed to send a number of students up to Ambassador College from Chile who had good academic abilities and good academic records, but really didn't have the English to sort of jump into a university situation. So,
right.
So we helped out with that, and that was great.
It's interesting you talk about Ambassador Foundation. That when I worked at the headquarters of the Worldwide Church of God, we managed one Ambassador Foundation project to Ukraine, where we sent 7 students to work for a whole summer to do just exactly that, teach English as a second language. And just from what I hear from like your program and from the programs that we did, that it looks like just a summer project, but it has life-lasting effects. People go back and they talk about what they did, what they learned. It's not just teaching the subject, but their relationship to the people, the culture, and everything else. So I'm sure that you have felt a lot of that.
Oh, very much so. I spent, like I said, I spent the first year after graduation in on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, which isn't a bad gig if you can get it, by the way. And yes, just interacted with the people, got to know them, got to love them, of course. Beautiful place, wonderful people, and the same after my wife and I got married. When we went to Chile, we talk about it as our 2 year honeymoon
Mm.
because we were there living, interacting with the culture, with the people, and it was wonderful. And still very fond memories, some fairly strong connections with some of the people from some of the Chilean brethren. It's wonderful place and wonderful people.
Would you say that you are fluent in French?
No, I would not say that. Someone who doesn't know French who hears me talking might say that.
Because I was
It,
reading this about you working in Martinique, and I thought, wow, I didn't realize that Kurt knew French.
Yes, no, I speak French. I can understand it with fluency.
Hmm.
I have not spoken it with any regularity for about 30 years, so it's a bit rusty when I try to speak. In fact, I was recently in Africa, in French-speaking Africa with Tim Pebworth,
Uh-huh.
and so I got a sort of a baptism of fire back into the French, and hope to be using it again some more. So
Uh-huh. So, some of the places that you have been to have been dangerous, like Afghanistan.
right,
Could you tell us a little bit about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan. No, Afghanistan was, I'll use the word very interesting a lot in this conversation, probably, but it was fascinating. I was there in 2013, and things had just started to get worse. Before I had arrived, embassy personnel were allowed to go into town, escorted, of course, with security and all that, but there was a fairly free amount of freedom of movement. After just before I got there, there was an attack nearby the embassy that impacted the embassy, so everything was shut down again. I kind of like to express it as being it was a maximum security Boy Scout camp.
Hmm.
Actually, I have a shirt that I bought there that says I was a resident of the world's most exclusive gated community, the Kabul condos.
Eh,
So,
so,
but the work there was interesting, and the Afghan people are amazing. I still feel for some of the locals who worked for us, wondering what they are going through or have gone through in the changes since then, when things have gotten a lot worse. So,
mhm.
but very brave, very dedicated local Afghans that we worked for. And just beautiful in spirit and in dedication to what they wanted to see their country look like.
Okay, and then you were transferred to Manila, where we had. Well, of course, you probably had a few other places in between, but then you
Right.
had.
Right.
How long was each tour? 2 years, 4 years?
2 to 3 years. Afghanistan was 1 year, but the first two tours are always 2 years, just so they can get you around to a number of different places and different sized embassies, so that you see if you how well you adjust to those sort of things. So that would have been Merida, Mexico, and Kenya for us.
Hmm.
And then after that, they're generally 3 years unless they're hardship.
Hmm.
And then they're 1 or 2 years. In Afghanistan, obviously, was considered hardship, so that was a single year. And it was just me in Afghanistan. My family was able to come with me in all the other places that we went to. So
Hmm.
Manila, we were there for 3 years, and again, interesting place. Worked on some fascinating issues. Um, I had a lot of opportunities to travel around the Philippines. I'm not a big fan of the city of Manila.
Hmm.
It's a large tropical city,
Hmm.
and but the great thing we always said about Manila is it's close to the Philippines, so you can hop on a plane, and in an hour you can be on a secluded beach somewhere, or out in the countryside, or up on the mountains or whatnot. So,
Well,
yeah.
I have really appreciated, the Philippines, and I have gone all the way from, the south, from Mindanao, and to the Visayas, which I really,
Hmm.
really, really enjoyed that area up there.
Yes.
And of
Yeah.
course, one thing you commented about in the things that we talked about is your appreciation for the people in the areas that you have
Yes.
been to. And I know that in my ministry, I have traveled, considerably too. I've been to almost 50 countries in all 50 states. But the thing I look upon most as I recall all those travels is the people and the relationships and the lasting eternal impact that people have had on me. And the safaris and all that other stuff is nice, but not why I went to begin with. And we have retired too. And people said, "No, you can travel." I said, "No, we've done all our traveling while we were working. And now we want to be able to write and ruminate and think about those areas."
Exactly. No, I understand, and certainly agree with you. It's the interacting with the culture and the people was one of the greatest joys of being in the Foreign Service and working for the State Department. You're not there as a tourist. You're not just waltzing in, dropping some money and waltzing back out. You're interacting with people. You're living with them. You're getting to know what their desires and dreams are. You have people coming to your house to do work for you. You've got you get to know the people in the local markets, all that sort of thing. And it's kind of sad when those opportunities are not available in some of the more secure places like Kabul, where you're not able to go out and interact as much with the local people. So that was really one of the great joys of that work, in addition to the fact that I was representing the United States and that flag was waving and all that, which is a huge honor as well. But yeah, that joy of not being a tourist, of really being there and interacting with people.
We had in my Rotary Club in Batavia, Ohio, where one of the clubs that I was in, one of our former presidents was the deputy ambassador to Iraq. And he actually took a tour, had 2 tours there, I believe. And again, he did not take his wife and family there, just like you did in those dangerous areas. And he was very, very close to an ISIS stronghold. But he was an amazing person. He was amazing in the fact that he said, "Here I am in Iraq. I'm looking at the same things that Jonah did when he came here,
Yes.
thousands of years ago." He was a Christian in his outlook. And I've asked him to come and speak to Ambassador Bible College on 2 different occasions. He was absolutely awesome, just very similar to you, connected with the people, connected with his being there, is certainly diplomatic, and he also worked in Israeli mission, the diplomatic service. But he was amazing in the things that he talked about. So that's very interesting. But now, Kurt, I'd like to turn to the things that you said that you're passionate about, the connections between archaeology and the Bible. And you talked about how archaeology illuminates the world of the Bible in ways that no other field can. Please tell us about how that has worked and what really directed you toward. Because when I heard about Kurt Hoyer in archaeology, it seemed, what? It was, why that particular field? And, on this podcast, I've actually had a number of people talk about archaeology. I've had Scott Ashley, Mario Sigli, Peter Eddington, that have talked about some of the explorations, the Sodom and other things that have been found here in the last several years. But I am very, very interested and intrigued by the things that you have discovered, not only in a general academic way, but personally. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Maybe as a little bit of background as to where my interest came from. And sorry, this may explode into just a huge ramble on on my part. So feel free to edit it for clarity.
What I want to do, Kurt, is that I can see right away that I really enjoy talking to you. I feel like this would be one of several podcasts, because here we want to get acquainted with you, where you've gone, but I would like to find out more about specifics, but I can't get into the specifics until you lead us to what this is all about.
Okay. Well, I'm down with that. We can do that. That's no problem. With that as a warning, the big ramble sort of thing. One of the most interesting classes I took at Ambassador College, and I think many people who took this class would agree, was Richard Page's History of Ancient Israel. And he was a Bible and a history class. And I found a real connection both with Dick Page and with the subject matter. And I would just sit there in class and just be utterly fascinated and walk out of it realizing I had remembered everything as well. That's how sucked in I was to the subject matter. then of course I went off and joined worked for the foundation, joined the Foreign Service, none of which has anything to do with archaeology. So for about 30 years I was in other things, but always dabbling in, always reading about, always researching, buying books to my wife's chagrin, and all that sort of thing on the subject of archaeology. And I was also touched at one point, and I don't remember where in sort of the history of all this that this little incident took place, but something that stuck with me. I was talking to a friend of mine who, and I don't even remember who it was, but a friend of mine about our experiences at Ambassador College, and he mentioned a conversation he'd had with Dr. Herman Hay, and he had asked Dr. Hay, what's the thing that the church needs most? We were graduating from Ambassador College, and sort of, where should we direct our lives sort of question. What is it the church is in most need of? And he told me, Dr. Hay, without hesitation, said, rigorous scholarship, which is a very Dr. Hay sort of answer, of course. But that always stuck with me as well. And I thought I wanted to apply that to a Christian Bible believer's approach to archaeology. Which means you go in knowing that you've got a certain approach and a certain bias in that sense, like everybody does. But if you're aware of it and you work with it, I think and in fact, I know there are so many connections between the Bible and archaeology and history that archaeology sort of brings to life. Because when you are working in an archaeological site and you find something, there's less room for interpretation and bias. There's a pot there. You find a storage jar. Okay, It is what it is. You can't make it up. You've got 100,000 other examples of the same thing, so you know what this is. It's been there for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. It has sort of its own story to tell. But why did you find it? In what conditions did you find it? What does that tell you about the people? You can look at the day-to-day pottery, for example, that people use through time, and you can see that there are changes. But there are also some things that remain constant. For example, if all the pottery you find is bowl-shaped, you find it in small houses, you find it in large houses, you find it in palaces, you know that those people ate things out of bowls. If, on the other hand, you find platters and plates, well, then you know that they were probably eating a slightly different food, because you don't put soup on a platter, for example. So, you can get these hints as to what people were doing and how they were, even their diet. And if you find, for example, a different set, consistently a different set of pottery in the temples, but lots of it, why do you have, thousands of platters in a temple? What that's not an individual sort of, coming and bringing an offering situation. You would find a few, but you wouldn't find that. Were these temples being used as a food source? Was part of the ritual to throw large feasts? And if that pottery is different in the temple than it is at the same time period in people's houses, are they eating different things, or why? And all these questions come to light and show us interesting patterns and habits of people through time. So when the Bible talks about when King Saul expects David to be at an event, and David asks Jonathan to go tell his father the king, well, I can't go because I've got this sacrifice that, family sort of thing we do every year. This begins to have, sort of tangible feeling to it, because you can see, yes, there were events like that. There were cultic, large religious feasts, or whatever you wish to call them, sometimes at the palace, sometimes at the temple. And then what people ate at home was a little bit different because the pottery used was different. So those are the sort of things I'm talking about.
So then you were able to take some of this evidence and connect it with festivals and worship and that type of thing.
In those different eras, those different activities, I mean, there are comments in all throughout the Bible about how the king is supposed to provide for the people. Maybe this was not just figurative. Maybe this was a very literal thing. Maybe one of the expectations of a king in that time period was to every once in a while throw a large extravagant feast to make sure that the poor were taken care of. So these sort of things, and we found these sort of things in other cultures as well, not just the biblical cultures. There was a certain amount of conspicuous consumption that was expected of the wealthy class, and particularly the rulers, as a way of showing that yes, you were the one God ordained to be, or the gods, depending on which religion you were, the gods ordained to be the ruler because you can provide this abundance. We found in Judah, particularly, they had a whole system of marking the storage jars for which agricultural products belonged to the king. This was probably it was a general system that was used for a significant period of time, but just before the invasion of Sennacherib, we see sort of an uptick in the presence of these types of jars. So it looks like that they knew Sennacherib was coming, and they were, doing some extra work to make sure they've got extra storage and foods, because they know that the Assyrian army is going to come. And, that's sort of like the zombie apocalypse at that time. If the Assyrians are coming, you're going to die.
Yeah, so they had their fallout shelters. And
yes, exactly. Exactly. They didn't run to the mall and hide out there. They brought food in.
Right.
And you can see these, they were stamped, the jars were stamped on the handles with these big clay jars with a signet seal. And you can trace these through history through a certain period of time. So you can see you can sense sort of the building panic when you see that sort of accumulation coming. And then when the Assyrians finally arrive, you have this whole series of letters written on pieces of pottery from Lachish, or found at Lachish, that talk about how they're looking for the signal fires of the city of Azekah, and they can't see it anymore. So you feel that, okay, the Assyrians took Azekah, Lachish is next. You can sort of feel this building tension, and all that's available because we dug it out of the ground, which is the fascinating part about it to me.
Well, the one thing that's so fascinating about archaeology, and some people may not, say, well, I'm not interested in rocks and that type of thing. But I think one thing that's rekindled an interest in archaeology is that it has actually proven some of the things that have been biblical. Events that perhaps have been put off as myth or made up or whatever, that never happened. Right. And then all of a sudden they find certain evidence that, again, this is Sodom. This is, here's evidence. Right. Here's some inscriptions that we have found that go back to what's in Deuteronomy. But we were talking about biblical archaeology, and perhaps not just exact phrase to use, but I had just come to the end of the subscription to Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, and I didn't know whether to continue my subscription to it or not. But the day that we decided to do the podcast, I just went ahead and resubscribed for another year, so I wouldn't have to be reminded. But
well, good. I hope I get a commission from that.
Not going to be very much. So it's a very small.
Hey, every little bit helps. Third career.
Getting people onto some of these publications. But tell us more about how the Bible and archaeology relate to each other. You kind of mentioned a little bit here,
right? But
anything more you can say right now?
Well, sure. It's generally accepted that, and it depends on whose count you're using for the number of people/events, but there are approximately 100 people mentioned in the Bible that have been attested in archaeology. Now, some of those are like Nebuchadnezzar and the kings of Assyria, and we've known about them for a long time, but they're still mentioned in the Bible. But there are some amazing connections in that way. For example, when you go to the Book of Kings, and this also, I think, illustrates how archaeology adds to what we have in the Bible, because the biblical writers, they were not writing history like we like our history, which is every single event, the exact date and the time, and doing it just to preserve the events. That's not what they did. They wrote history with a lesson. There was a reason why, and you can see that because you read the books of Kings and Chronicles, particularly Kings, and you see all the kings of Israel were bad. Some of the kings of Judah were good. Some of them were bad. So when you get a bad king like Manasseh, you get 17 lines about Manasseh. He was the longest ruling king of Judah, 55 years. Surely he did more in his life than 17 lines.
He sure
But
did.
the Bible writers didn't care about that because their lesson was Israel suffered when it had a bad king. And it proves that lesson by citing historical events. So, for example, you're talking about, if we want to talk about the kings of Israel, all of whom were bad, one of the worst that comes to mind is King Ahab. He's the one who married Jezebel. He stole the field from the vineyard from one of his subjects. He did and murdered him. He had some pretty horrible things. Roundly condemned in Scripture.
He was the Putin of his time.
Yeah. He was not a nice man, and apparently his wife was not a nice person either. Not someone you want as a neighbor, that's for sure.
But you do have very vivid stories about them. But if you can find evidence,
right?
Well, what that evidence does is give you more faith, and then maybe other things are true.
Exactly. And with the situation with Ahab is that in the Assyrian annals, there was a time when an Assyrian king by the name of Shalmaneser III decided he was going to invade the area of Syria, Israel, Canaan, however you wish to label it. He called it Hatti land. That's the Assyrian name for that whole area. And he marched over and he met with a coalition of, he says, 11 kings. There were only 9, but he says 11, and there's reasons why he says 11. But anyway, he comes over and he fights his battle at a place called Karkar, and he claims a great victory. But for the next 3 or 4 years, he's never there again. Great victory, but he didn't tear down any cities. He didn't do whatever. So it looks like, and he has to come back a few times, and he keeps trying. So it looks like what happened is there was a big battle, and it was probably either a defeat for the Assyrians or at least a draw. It was strategically inconclusive. It kind of kept things the way they are. But he mentions who was involved in the battle on the other side. And the second person he mentions is Ahab the Israelite. And Ahab the Israelite has the second largest army in the entire coalition. And he's compared to the king of Aram Damascus, which was a fairly powerful kingdom at that time and was the main target of the Assyrian invasion. So the king of Damascus had pulled together this coalition that included Ahab the Israelite, and they successfully stopped the Assyrian army from coming further, at least for a time period, into Israel and Judah, which is very interesting. I mean, that's a huge strategic setback for the Assyrians. It did not happen very often, and we don't hear about any of that in the Bible because it's not part of the biblical lesson or the biblical stories that they wanted to tell. So even this bad king had a fairly long-term, impact on the geostrategic machinations of his day. Now, this coalition fell apart very quickly, apparently, because pretty soon Ahab is fighting against the king of Aram Damascus, and they battle back and forth for a number of years. But it's interesting because it shows both the power of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the ability and the way these countries and entities interacted. Now, the specific numbers are probably exaggerated. Kings always brag about their enemies being bigger than they really were. But the fact that he's got the second largest army is indicative of the position of importance that Israel played in that conflict.
Yeah, in the scale of the nations around. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And as you said, well, that gives us proof that this guy named Ahab existed, which is great. It also helps. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about the histories in the Bible is no matter when whatever position you take upon when they were written. Some people say they weren't written until after the exile.
Right.
Okay, let's accept that. They weren't written until after the exile. They got the kings' names right and in the right order.
Mm-hmm.
That, in and of itself, if it was written then, is an amazing accomplishment
Mm-hmm.
because you're talking 500 years after the events took place, more or less. Well, 300
Mm-hmm.
years after the events took place, more or less. If that's where you position the writing. I
Yeah.
don't position the writing there, but
Well, there's certain things that were edited very obviously. When
yes,
in the books of Moses, what he says, and Moses died, obviously that was edited.
right,
Somebody, I
exactly,
mean, there were different canonizations where
right,
of the Bible, periods
right.
where groups of whoever
Mm-hmm.
authorized people got together and created the canon as we have it. And
Right,
it had edits. The same is true for the New Testament. Some of
right,
the books there. It wasn't that they
right,
were walking around with recording everything at
right.
that moment, and that was it. It was
Mm-hmm.
carefully gone through,
Mm-hmm.
word by word,
Right,
as it is today.
right. Yeah, and I think they had annals and short histories, and these are the events of so and so's reign. Um, Probably in Israel and Judah, just like the Assyrians had. They just did it in different ways,
Hmm.
and those records were available for them to go look at. And the writers who wanted to use that history to teach a certain lesson chose the events that helped highlight those lessons that they wanted to teach.
Hmm.
I love the way the New Testament puts it. For example, it says all Scripture is inspired of God.
Right.
It doesn't say every author. It says all of the finished product
Hmm.
is inspired by God. So that includes the authors, the editors, the compilers,
Hmm.
whoever
Hmm.
was involved in that chain. The end product is still inspired by God.
Hmm. Yeah, just like right now, many things that we have that we use to prove things are written by people who don't necessarily believe the way we do, but their scholarship is honored.
Mm-hmm. Just as another example, one of the this may be getting too deep in the weeds. I don't know, but it's an interesting find that most people are probably aware of. It's the Tel Dan stele, which mentions the House of David.
Hmm.
Um,
Let's hear about
and
it. Yeah.
this, yeah, this is. We have to roll the time clock back a little bit, but again, we're talking about the Northern Kingdom of Israel. We're talking about its conflict with the Syrians out of Damascus, and they went back and forth. And at one point, there was a very powerful king, who is mentioned in the Bible, Hazael, who became king in Damascus, and he conquered large swaths of the Near East. He probably forced Israel, the Northern Kingdom of Israel, to be a vassal state, possibly the Southern Kingdom of Judah as well. We know he went all the way down to Ekron, which was a Philistine city, and conquered Ekron. So he was very powerful. He did a lot of damage, and
Hmm.
we can trace his damage through the archaeological record in many cases. Captured Dan, all these places, and sort of carved off the eastern part of the Northern Kingdom of Israel. Everything east of the Jordan River is basically what he conquered and took over. And like I said, probably forced Israel and Judah to become vassal states.
Hmm.
Anyway, so he's mentioned in Scripture, and so that's one source. Now we also have the Tel Dan stele, which most scholars attribute to Hazael. May not it's not anchored in a temporal context. We don't know exactly what date it was written. But the Tel Dan stele does a couple of amazing things. It talks about a king from Aram Damascus who comes down and he kills the king of Israel and the king of a place he calls the House of David,
Hmm.
or the king of the House of David, whether it's a place or not. He mentions the king of Israel. The names are broken, but it looks like it's I'm going to forget their name, Joram and Ahaziah,
Hmm.
Israel and Judah. This is the time of Jehu's revolt,
Hmm.
and the Bible talks about how Jehu, is anointed to become king because Ahab's descendants are so bad. Jehu comes from eastern Israel. He was up defending one of the cities of eastern Israel on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So he would have had contact with Hazael. So the question is, did he make some sort of pact with the king and then come over and wipe out the king of Israel and the king of Judah? Um, anyway, we know the biblical story. He comes from that area. He comes across. He kills both the kings of Israel and Judah.
Hmm.
Now it's interesting that in the Tel Dan stele, the king of Syria, the king of Aram, he claims that he's the one who killed them. And so we have to figure out, okay, what does this bragging mean?
Hmm.
Okay. Now it's very likely that Jehu is the one who actually killed them. He did so sort of under the auspices of the new king of Aram. So he gets to claim he killed them, just like, because he's the conqueror. He
Uh-huh.
can claim he killed them. But in doing so, he throws out that phrase, king of the house of David. Now, you don't say that about an insignificant entity.
Hmm.
If you are a powerful kingdom and you talk about the house of so and so, it's because they are a fairly significant entity. The
Hmm.
Assyrians do this with the northern kingdom of Israel, sort of post Ahab. Um, After that, it's almost always referred to as the house of Omri because Omri was such a powerful king up
Hmm.
there. So
Hmm.
they know him by Omri. So that tells us that the people from around Damascus looked at the southern kingdom and saw it as the house of David. So this means that David existed, that Judah was a significant player at that particular time, and more importantly, it also means that Solomon and all the other kings existed. I mean, we have no archaeological attestation of Solomon. There's nothing been found with Solomon's name on it.
Hmm.
But because you say House of David, now you're talking a dynasty, and
Hmm.
that means a dynasty existed. So therefore, we have no reason to doubt that everybody else in that dynasty existed.
Well, that's very interesting about no direct archaeological evidence of Solomon.
In the sense that no name has come up.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And people use that to say, well, Solomon never existed. Well, I'm sorry, you can't do that because you have the House of David,
Right.
which means there was a dynasty that was recognized by the enemy,
Right.
and they knew it as a dynasty.
And it showed their regarding it as something.
Yes,
You know
exactly,
that we dealt with the power of that time,
exactly,
and then you're getting
right,
close to Solomon by mentioning
right,
House of David.
exactly, exactly. So, I mean, yeah, you don't have to have everybody's name. You don't have to
Uh-huh.
have all the people who didn't rule. You don't have to have their names either. You just, there
Well,
was a house, there was a dynasty.
one thing I find very interesting in the things that you have written was the fact that archaeology and is not just spectacular finds of one place, but just a stringing together of one event after another and staying with things. I found that interesting. Perhaps we could talk about that even in another
Mm-hmm.
podcast. But the whole study of archaeology is somewhat arduous.
Yes,
It's not finding some spectacular thing that'll become a major motion picture, but
right,
something that pieces together things like even a statement like this, the House of David. Well, that was known, that's documented,
right.
that can't be just ignored, and so that. But have you? Let me just shift the question a little bit. What archaeological excavations have you been on or are planning to go on?
I have over the years been on a number of them. I was at Hatzor up in northern Israel, a very important city. It's the largest archaeological site in the state of Israel. It's over 200 acres
Mm.
in size. It's huge. It's a city that was mentioned in the archives of Mari, which is over in Syria and Iraq. So it was a well-known, large, influential city. The Bible talks about it as the head. Hatzor was the head of all those kingdoms
Hmm.
in the past. So
Hmm.
it seemed to have a large and influential role in that region, all the way up into northern Mesopotamia, and it features obviously in the conquest narratives as well. So I worked there for one summer. Didn't find anything spectacular, but that's okay. It was a lot of fun. That was my introduction. We moved a lot of dirt. um, but then I also have worked at Tel Lachish, which is a fairly famous site. I worked at Kubik, which has become famous recently in the last 10 years or so because of an ostraca that was found there, um, and is very impactful for the history of the Kingdom of Judah. Uh, I worked at Tel Bet Mersim, which is a famous site only because of who worked there. It was where William Foxwell Albright first did his excavations
Right.
in Israel in the 1920s, and that's the site upon which all the chronology of pottery is based. It was his work that set that up.
Hmm.
So although it's not, it doesn't feature anywhere in scripture or anything like that. It's archaeologically, it's an important site for its impact on the field of archaeology.
Well, one thing I find very interesting, you mentioned Wright, and I went to Ambassador College in 1966. Dr. Hay taught 2 classes in theology, and in one class he spoke a lot about the archaeology of of those areas.
Right.
But what's been found since has been just many, many times more that. And he would mention Wright, he would mention Kathleen Kenyon, with her
Mm-hmm.
work in Jericho, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
But the work that's been done in Jericho has been just many, many times more thorough and far advanced. And yet, back in 1966, that was, look at this, we found this, and
Right.
what archaeology has done. And I
Right.
feel that perhaps archaeology will even have a greater impact as you have irrefutable proof that even people who are skeptics can't ignore,
Right.
such as this House of David remark.
Right.
Because there are people that absolutely disregard the Bible completely. The Exodus never took place. We don't have any evidence of anything.
Mm-hmm.
There was no real Israelites, maybe except for a couple of hundred people that just crossed a swamp. They
Mm-hmm. Right.
minimize it
Right.
greatly
Right.
and take away from the grandeur that we see biblically. And I find what the work that you're doing is to try to take a very, very honest look at the evidence, square it with texts of the Bible that,
Right.
it's unbelievable that how textually thorough the Bible is, how it's survived, and how there are so many copies of it compared to the Iliad
Right.
and the Odyssey,
Yes, exactly.
that are
Right.
looked upon
Yeah.
with great regard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I find to be a very interesting new chapter in the work of archaeology, and I really applaud you for the work that you're doing and making it interesting to people who may not
Well,
be interested in archaeology.
and I totally agree. I think there's never been a more exciting time in some ways than now to be in archaeology. And part of that is because archaeologists have come to the realization that they need to open the field to other people. When Albright and Kenyon and those people were digging, it was just the archaeologists. Now you've got a specialist in bones, a specialist in pollen, a specialist in birds,
Mm-hmm.
and in plants. You've got microarchaeology now, where they can even take a look at at that microscopic level at different, things and find evidence that you wouldn't find anywhere else.
Amazing.
And yeah, and it's incredible. And of course, with AI and computers now, we can look for patterns that we, in a few seconds that would have taken years to find. And archaeology is a lot about patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Look, there's always going to be controversy. There's always going to be people who disagree with whatever find. And part of that is because the field of knowledge is expanding. The base of knowledge is expanding so much that you get an archaeologist who spent 20, 30 years doing his or her work, and then some new technology comes along, or some new evidence comes along that sort of overturns that, or says, hey, no, we need to take another look at the established truth. That's really hard to do, because you've dedicated 30 or 40 years establishing this, whatever it is, as the paradigm, and now somebody comes along with new evidence and says, no, we need to adjust that a little bit, or change it, or overturn it, or whatever. So you're always going to have that as
Mm-hmm.
well, because that's human nature. It's really hard to say, oh, I was wrong all my life. I'll embrace the new evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but with the accumulation of evidence and the fine tuning that we can get now, the field is ripe for sort of a new turning of how these things are put together. For example, and a lot of it's just the massive information we have, or that is becoming available. Not quite there yet. People are beginning to notice that, and when you talk about the conquest of a city, archaeologically, what you're looking for when you're doing that is some sort of burning, because cities burn when they fall. So you look for the charcoal, or if you happen to be digging and you find a 3-inch layer of burn and ash, well, something amazing took place.
Catastrophic.
Or amazing. Well, not amazing for the people at the time, obviously, but amazing for us archaeologists. Yeah, burn layers, destruction layers, we love them. I feel sorry for the people at the time, but we love them. But we've also learned just recently through some archaeology out of it. It's called experimental archaeology, where they built houses out of mud brick like they were built in the old days, and tried to burn them to see what would happen. And because typically, remember, when you're doing an archaeological dig, you're in one small piece of the entire site.
Mm-hmm.
Most archaeological sites, if they are 4% excavated, that's considered extensively excavated at 4%.
Mm-hmm.
So you're in this one spot. You're in a 5 meter by 5 meter square, and you find at a certain level a huge ash layer. 2 or 3 inches of ash. The city was destroyed, wiped out the entire city. Especially if you find it at another place as well, because you might be digging 2 or 3 squares.
Right.
So at the same level, you find this. Well, that may not be true, because cities back then didn't burn very well. And if it is true, then we're learning that this is a conscious act. It doesn't happen. Burning of an entire city did not happen by accident. And we get a hint of that at the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem falls, and then about a month later, it says the Babylonians burned the city. But that was after it had fallen. And it took them about a month to, rob everything they could rob, and pile up branches and wood and whatever they wanted to burn, to light the city on fire, to burn it to the ground and knock all the buildings over, because mud brick just doesn't burn very well. And stone obviously doesn't burn very well. And so that sort of detail, now we know when we dig at a city, when we find a couple inches of ash, we have to be careful. We can't say the entire city was burned. Well, maybe this building was burned. Okay, why was just this building burned? The questions become different. Instead of who conquered the city at this time, it's, okay, let's find out why this building burned. Now, if this building was the gate of the city, maybe the city was conquered anyway. Okay, and just the gate was burned because that's the place they were attacking.
Yeah.
But the rest of the city didn't burn, because they don't burn by accident. You have to burn them on purpose. And similarly, you can find just different types of remains at the same time within the same city. So, it used to be when you found a type of pottery, again, you're only digging part of the city. Well, everybody used this pottery in this city at this time. Therefore, everybody in the whole area used this type of pottery. Well, there's more and more evidence that fine-tunes that and makes it look like, well, there are some, this makes sense, because, you don't just throw out your pottery one day. You don't throw out all your dishes one day because Wedgwood came out with a new design. Right?
Well,
nobody does that.
For very few people.
Yeah, very few people do that. So we've always assumed that the same pottery means the same time frame. The same pottery assemblage means the same time frame. Now, we know in the back of our mind that there's probably, between different cities, there's probably some offset there. It's not going to be hundreds of years, but it's going to be some offset there. And now we're just beginning to sort of have the amount of data available to start to try to make those fine-tuned judgments, which to me is really exciting, because even a 20 or 30-year difference in a dating scale between two different areas can rewrite, if you will, the history of what you're looking for. I mean, when you're talking about the conquest, for example, which was, Joshua's 6 years or so. Well, if you change the dating by 20 years, because of a more finely tuned approach to your dating cycle, that can either make it within or not within that time frame. If you're only talking about a 6-year time frame, now it'd be very, very hard for us to get as detailed as 6 years. That would be that would be a miracle, because we always have to have date ranges. So,
okay. Listen, Kurt, this has been just fascinating talking to you for this what I call preliminary podcast, because we got into some things, and I hope that you can come back.
I would be more than happy to come back.
Okay.
So we'll set it up for another time.
We'll set up for another time, and then just discuss further some of the points that you had brought out here. But this was very, very interesting. I learned things I hadn't known before. So thank you very much. Appreciate your being here.
Well, my pleasure to be here. I hope people find it interesting, and I hope people find, like I do, that I find archaeology to be very faith affirming.
Mm-hmm.
That the writers in the Bible knew what they were talking about, but at the same time, we have to realize they weren't writing like we write or
Mm-hmm.
like we want them to write.
Uh-huh.
So we have to be careful to read them the way they were intended to be read. But when we do, we find out that they knew that what they were talking about.
Okay, thank you. On that note, we'll leave it. Thank you so much once again, Kurt.
All right. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you for listening to us today on the Kubik Report. We welcome you to share this podcast and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and many other platforms. You can easily find us at any browser address box by typing in the words The Kubik Report, and there we are. Remember, Kubik is spelled Kubik. We'd love to hear from you. Write to us at vkubik@gmail.com. That's vkubik@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening. Come back soon for more.